Hi and welcome to the session. Today we're going to be covering Cloudyn to Azure Cost Management, Transition and Guidance. We've got a lot to cover, so let's dive straight in. Now on February the 6th, 2019, Azure Cost Management released to general availability for EA customers. It's currently in private preview for WebDirect or pay-as-you-go customers and for GovCloud customers. Later this year, it will become available for AWS customers and for Cloud Solution Provider or CSP partners and their customers. So what does this mean for Cloudyn customers? Well, over time, Azure Cost Management will replace Cloudyn, and ultimately, probably in 2020, Cloudyn will be retired. In this presentation, I want to provide some helpful guidance for Cloudyn customers. I'll start by covering some of the history of this project and explain some of the key benefits of Azure Cost Management compared to Cloudyn. I then want to look at the roadmap for Azure Cost Management from the point of view of a Cloudyn customer. This will help you understand when you should plan to transition, because we have some feature milestones coming up for Azure Cost Management, and determining the best time to transition for a Cloudyn customer requires that you understand what features you're using today and compare that to the Azure Cost Management roadmap so as to remove or minimize any loss of features you may experience in the transition from Cloudyn to ACM. We'll also compare the architecture from a very high level and compare the handling of entities and tags. Then we'll walk through a feature by feature comparison. And finally, we'll compare the data exports of Cloudyn with those of Azure Cost Management. What we will not cover today is a technical overview and demo of Azure Cost Management. I have covered that previously in a separate presentation, which is titled Azure Cost Management Technical Overview. In this presentation, we're going to focus on the comparison of Azure Cost Management with Cloudyn. So if you're a Cloudyn user, I would look at this presentation first, but then please be sure to look at my other presentation focusing on Azure Cost Management online also. Before we dive into the details of Azure Cost Management and Cloudyn, it's worth stepping back for a moment to discuss the overall objectives of Cloud Cost Management. Cost management is an iterative cycle to manage cloud resources in a way that balances the priorities of management teams, finance teams, and app dev teams. It starts with providing visibility of costs by providing tools that provide charting, analysis, drill down, slice and dice capabilities, and the tools to share and socialize the results of that analysis. Next is accountability. This means making people accountable for the costs that they incur with tools that provide scoped access, budgeting, alerts, cost allocation, and the ability for chargeback or showback to cost centers with automated emails. Finally, optimization refers to tools to help identify wastage and recommend changes to optimize the use of resources. This includes tools to help with right sizing and reserved instance optimization. It was in recognition of these challenges that Microsoft purchased Cloudyn, a leader in cost management, in June 2017. Since then, we have continued to run the Cloudyn service at cloudyn.com and have attracted tens of thousands of new users over that period of time. Meanwhile, we have also integrated the Cloudyn engineers into the Azure Dev team to work on Azure Cost Management, which is a totally new cost management solution designed from the ground up to run on Azure in the Azure Portal and to deliver the best of both Cloudyn and the Enterprise Portal, while, wherever possible, utilizing rather than replicating the core Azure services, like, for example, Azure Active Directory, Azure Resource Manager or ARM, Role-Based Access Controls or RBAC, and the related security services, management groups, action groups, Azure Advisor, Azure Policies, Storage, and Tags. Azure provides all these services, and so it's important to use them rather than replicating them. The intent is to make Azure Cost Management the one-stop shop for cloud cost management, information and tools. And over 2019, we'll work with the Cloudyn users to get them all transitioned across to Azure Cost Management before we retire Cloudyn sometime next year in 2020. Already, over 70% of Azure Enterprise customers are using Azure Cost Management. Let's look at how to access Azure Cost Management in the portal. So I'll quickly log on to the Azure Portal at portal.azure.com. And to get to Azure Cost Management, we click on Cost Management and Billing in the left-hand menu to open the Cost Management and Billing blade. Then click on Cost Management, and Azure Cost Management consists of these entries in the left-hand menu: Cost Analysis, Cost Alerts, Budgets, Advisor Recommendations, and Exports. So let's start by looking at some of the key benefits of Azure Cost Management compared to Cloudyn. For many people, the most popular feature of Azure Cost Management is that it is on by default. For EA users, there are two settings in the EA portal that need to be set, more on that later, and users need to have at least Reader or Cost Management Reader access for the scope they are interested in. Beyond that, there's no setup. You just can simply walk up to it and start using it. By contrast, in Cloudyn, you need to set up API keys for each account. One of the byproducts of this, because it's built in, Azure Cost Management provides improved reliability, particularly when used with Azure, because there are no fragile API keys or linked EAs that might expire. The solution is just more robust. Another key benefit flowing from this tight integration is reduced latency. When used with Azure, Azure Cost Management is delivering accurate reporting within 8 hours of you incurring a cost in Azure. This allows users to respond much more rapidly, for example, when cost spikes might occur. Azure Cost Management also provides far richer, more modern and intuitive analysis tools. The cost analysis tools in Azure Cost Management provide the ability to drill down, slice and dice your data, and group and filter and view by over 14 dimensions in the case of the EA channel, as well as by custom tags. It provides custom date ranges, daily, monthly granularity, and will soon support the ability to save and schedule email distribution of report views. The budgeting capability in Azure Cost Management is integrated with the analysis tools and can provide alerts based on the percent of budget. These alerts can trigger emails or action group actions, which can kick off email, SMS, push or voice notifications, or you can trigger Azure functions, which you can program yourself, or logic apps, webhook routines, or ITSM or automation runbooks. So as you can see, the integration of alerts into the budgeting capability in Azure Cost Management brings with it a huge amount of flexibility. As mentioned previously, Microsoft purchased Cloudyn, a leader in cloud cost management, in June 2017. Since then, Cloudyn engineers have been integrated into the Azure Dev team and have been working on Azure Cost Management, which became generally available for EA customers in February 2019. This is referred to as Milestone 1. As we move forward, we will see multiple feature releases which you can group into milestones. Let's look in more detail at these milestones and what they mean for customers transitioning from Cloudyn. Azure Cost Management went into general availability on the 6th of February 2019 for EA customers, which we consider to be Milestone 1. This release includes the foundation and many of the key features of Azure Cost Management, including ad hoc reporting and cost analysis, cost and consumption APIs, Azure Advisor compute and reservation recommendations, budgets with alerts and actions, lower latency, the ability to export data to storage accounts, the Power BI Content Pack and Connector. So if you're a Cloudyn user, the obvious question is, okay, so if that is available, should I transition now? Well, if you're an EA customer and you're just using ad hoc cost analysis reports, budgets and alerts, Azure pricing and sizing optimization, then you're good to go. But if you're using some of the other more advanced features in Cloudyn, you may want to wait for one of the later ACM milestones. So let's talk about those. Milestone 2 will be available to EA, but also now GovCloud and WebDirect customers, and adds support for the ability to save reports into report libraries and the ability to schedule reports and have those reports automatically emailed to people. So if you are one of those sorts of customers and you're a Cloudyn user who is saving reports into report libraries or using automated distributions of those reports by emails, but you're not using cost allocation through Cost Allocation 360 models, then you should be good to go and transition with Milestone 2. Milestone 3 will be available to EA, GovCloud and WebDirect as before, but will add CSP or Cloud Solution Providers customers. This milestone adds cost allocation, which is required for complete showback and chargeback of all your cloud spend, and CSP features such as single pane of glass, markup, custom charges, etc. So with milestone 3, essentially all customer types will be able to transition, including users who use Cost Allocation 360 models, cost allocation analysis reports, projection and forecasting, cost markup and custom charges, and the CSP features. So after Milestone 3, all Cloudyn customers should then be migrating to Azure Cost Management. So let's look at a high-level view comparing the architecture, or at least the main architectural components of Cloudyn with Azure Cost Management. Here on the left we see the main features of Cloudyn split into the core functions at the top and support functions on the bottom. Support functions are those that are not unique to Cloudyn and so can be replaced by standard Azure services. On the right we see the corresponding Azure Cost Management components at the top, or native Azure services replacing the Cloudyn support functions on the bottom. Rather than discuss each of these in detail here, let's look in more detail at what's happening for each of these features in the following slides. If you're a Cloudyn admin, then you'll know that one of the first things you need to do when setting up Cloudyn is to open this accounts management page and do a couple of things. Firstly, you need to set up or connect accounts and subscriptions using API keys and credentials to allow cost and consumption information to be imported from your cloud provider, typically either Azure or AWS. Secondly, you need to set up an account hierarchy or entities which allows you to mimic your corporate structure and position accounts and subscriptions within that structure. This also creates a boundaries to which you can then apply Cloudyn Role-Based Access Control or RBAC. You need to be aware of some big changes when it comes to moving to Azure Cost Management. First, if you're an Azure user, there's no need to set up or connect accounts and subscriptions using API keys and credentials because it is built into Azure and on by default. The connections are internal to Azure and so no API keys are needed, and as I mentioned earlier, this makes for a more robust and reliable solution with better performance and lower latency times. If on the other hand you're an AWS user, you're still going to need to set up and connect accounts and subscriptions using API keys and credentials in a similar manner. The second thing is that the Cloudyn entity hierarchy on the left-hand side of this page is replaced by Azure billing entities and resource entities, most notably Azure management groups. So let's look at Azure billing and resource entities in more detail. Billing and resource entities are the cornerstone of how costs are organized and analyzed in Azure Cost Management. They include what you see in the Azure Cost Management Group By drop-down box. And that's going to change depending on what type of customer you are, or as you say, what channel you are using. Azure Cost Management manages several customer types, or what we call channels. For example, for Azure we have EA customers, Web Direct or pay-as-you-go customers, and Cloud Solution Providers or CSPs. Each of these are a different channel and can have different billing entities, but they all share the same resource entities. The relevant resource entities are management groups, subscriptions, resource groups, and resources. Moving forward, over time, the EA, Web Direct, and CSP channels will be replaced by a new modern commerce channel. This modern commerce channel is designed to handle the superset of requirements of EA, CSP, and Web Direct customers. AWS is and will remain a separate channel with its own unique billing entities. Let's look at the EA channel as an example of this. This diagram shows a hierarchy of entities for the EA channel. Managing costs and controlling access using the entity hierarchy requires an understanding of scopes and roles across Azure and the EA portal. Depending on what level in the hierarchy you need access to, determines what roles and privileges are needed. Let's look at this in more detail. This table shows you what roles you need at each level in the case of the EA channel. As you can see, for resource entities in blue, management group, subscription, and resource group, you need at least cost management reader or reader role. Above that, for access to cost information for the billing entities, you need either owner or admin roles, which is something you normally want to limit to just those who need it. Also note that if you want to create budgets or alerts, you will need a higher level of access, and you should have the cost management contributor role. A best practice we recommend is that you follow what is known as a principle of using the least privileged RBAC role required to do the job. So you would like to avoid giving people owner or admin roles if all they really need to do is analyze or create budgets. The best way to do that is with Azure Management Groups. Azure Management Groups is a relatively new feature to Azure. Management Groups are containers that help you manage access, policy, and compliance across multiple subscriptions. You can create these containers in a hierarchy to represent, for example, the organizational structure of your company. Management groups can be then used to more simply apply policy and Azure role-based access controls. Apart from their other benefits, management groups also allow you to grant a user cost management reader or reader role, as required for Azure Cost Management, on a management group so that they then have that access to all the subscriptions down the hierarchy from that point. So then, by defining even one root management group above all the other management groups and subscriptions, you can give a user cost management or reader role across all the subscriptions in an account without needing to grant owner or admin roles. So in this way you can comply to that best practice of least privilege. So if you have more than one subscription, I would seriously consider using at least one management group. As mentioned before, moving forward over time, the EA, Web Direct, and CSP channels will be replaced by the new modern commerce channel. This is designed to handle the superset of requirements of EA, CSP, and Web Direct customers. It will support multiple billing profiles, each producing separate invoices, potentially in different currencies, all rolling into a single billing account. Oh, and one more thing. There are a couple of settings in the EA portal you need to enable to use Azure Cost Management with an enterprise agreement. They are the DA view charges, or Department Administrator view charges, and the AO view charges, or Account Owner view charges, as shown in the screenshot on this page. As Cloudyn users, you'll know that using entities has their limitations when it comes to analysing costs. As with Cloudyn entities, Azure entities and management groups often do not neatly allow you to separate costs by cost center or project, or however you want to look at costs. Often multiple cost centers can be using resources in a single subscription. And a cost center can have its costs spread out across multiple subscriptions. For example, some companies have dev and test subscriptions and handle multiple projects from multiple cost centers in each of these. This is where tags can be useful. Tags allow you to tag individual resources and resource groups so they can be separated out when they are spread across multiple subscriptions. A tag is a name-value pair. A tag might have a name, for example, or a key, as it's sometimes referred to, of environment. So it might have a name or a key of environment. And then on different resources, that environment tag might have different values like dev and test or engineering or sales. If you do that consistently across your subscriptions, then you can analyze costs by that environment tag. The difficult thing to achieve, though, is that consistency. And to do that, you need to establish policies and apply governance to ensure compliance. A recommended best practice is to use Azure Policy to enforce tagging. Please see the resource slide at the end of this deck for some links to some more information on this. Another best practice often involves having tags for finance codes, for application contexts, deployment contexts, and a tag indicating who is responsible for that resource. Tag handling is quite different in ACM compared to Cloudyn. Cloudyn provides metadata enhancement by adding implicit tags and by giving the user option to add custom tags per account and per entity, as well as the ability to use a category manager to define rules to control the addition of additional custom tags. ACM adopts a different approach and assumes that tags should be set by the cloud service, be it Azure or AWS, and that ACM is to analyze costs based on those tags rather than creating new ones. I'm not going to go into this slide in detail, but suffice it to say that the way tags and categories are represented in Cloudyn reports can be quite confusing, and the naming conventions are a little inconsistent. ACM is much easier to use and has a much simpler interface. Here's an example of that, but rather than show you on the slides, I'll jump across to a very quick demo. But what I did want to show you here is the group by capability and the fact that the built-in dimensions are shown here, or more specifically, as I described before, the entity and resource dimensions, and down the bottom we have the tag. I think I showed that before as well. The other thing worth mentioning while I'm in here is how to apply filters. In Azure Cost Management, the application of filters is pretty easy. For example, if I was to group by meter subcategory, for example, now there are multiple ways I can filter this view. I can simply click on a sector in the pie chart, and you will notice at the top now I have a service name virtual machines. This is a filter. I can then click the cross to remove that. Similarly, I can click on any color on the main part of the chart to click by the dimension member represented by that color. Boom. So now I'm only looking at the FSV2 series windows, and I can remove that one. Or finally, I can use the pill at the top and select a particular resource type, for example, and then what members of that dimension I want to view. The advantage of this approach is it allows me to select more than one of the members to filter by. Now let's look at migration from Cloudyn to ACM by taking a feature-by-feature walkthrough of Cloudyn and looking at what the corresponding equivalent is in Azure Cost Management. Before we look at individual features, the first gating factor to migration is what type of customer you are. EA customers can migrate now if they are satisfied with the feature coverage. WebDirect and GovCloud customers are currently in preview and will GA with M2 or Milestone 2. AWS and Cloud Solution Provider customers will be able to migrate with Milestone 3. Now with that said, let's do a feature by feature walkthrough. If you're familiar with the Cloudyn UI, I'm going to look through quickly at the cog icon and then the costs menu, the resources menu, and the optimizer menu and the my tools menu. And for each of those, and the dashboard menu actually, and for each of those I'm going to look at the equivalent translation in Azure Cost Manager. If we first look at the gear icon or cog wheel menu in Cloudyn and look at each menu selection, Cloudyn user management in ACM is done by Azure Active Directory, the Cloudyn Cloud Accounts page we discussed earlier. Recipient lists, user logon history, and reports activity status have no ACM equivalents at this time. Report storage is not needed because we use Azure Storage. The category manager has no equivalent in ACM. In fact, ACM does not do any metadata enhancement. Cloudyn dashboards are simply replaced by Azure dashboards.
Looking at the Cloudyn costs menu, if you are just using cost analysis reports and budgets, then that is supported now, and you can move to Azure Cost Management now in Milestone 1. But note that support for saving of reports to create report libraries will not be added until Milestone 2. If, however, you are using Cost Allocation 360 models, Cost Allocation Analysis, Forecasting, or Custom Charges, these capabilities are currently expected in Milestone 3.
Moving on to the Cloudyn Resources menu, I will not step through each of the possible selections because I can provide some more general guidance. Single dimensional resource views showing costs can generally be achieved using Azure Cost Management cost analysis. Multi-dimensional views supporting Excel pivot table compatible exports are not yet supported. Views showing measures rather than costs are not yet supported. Looking at the Cloudyn Optimizer menu, in general, Azure Advisor replaces most of the options in the Optimizer menu tree and provides a lot of additional functionality as well, including recommendations on improving security, availability and performance. One thing to note is that ACM does not provide lists of reservations because they are available elsewhere in Azure and in AWS.
Looking at the Cloudyn My Tools menu, saving of reports into a report library will not be supported until Milestone 2. Budget alerts are available now in Azure Cost Management, but alerts for scheduled reports, recommendations and other alerts are not supported at this time. Looking at the management of enterprise entities, these are handled for Azure Cost Management by built-in features including Azure Entities, Azure Management Groups and the Scope Hierarchy. And of course, accounts are managed in Azure Cost Management by Azure Active Directory, which works hand in hand with Azure Resource Manager.
One topic I get a lot of questions about is how and where you can export to Excel in a manner that supports pivot tables. The Cloudyn Resource Explorer does an excellent job of that. When you export from that tool, you get a spreadsheet page with the following format. Note here that we have one column for every one of multiple dimensions and one column for every measure. You can see that dimension columns contain dimension members as text, whereas measure columns contain aggregates of measure values as numbers. This is a format you need to easily create pivot table and provides a powerful tool for exporting cost data. By contrast, Cloudyn Cost Report exports create a page with the following format. As you can see, not so helpful if you want to create a pivot table. Azure Cost Management exports are heading in the right direction. If you export to Excel from this view, then this is what you get. This is good. It's heading in the right direction. It's in the right format to create a pivot table. There is currently a limitation that the ACM reporting tools only allow you to group by one specified dimension at a time, which means you can only specify one dimension and have it included in the export. The dev team are looking at changing that, but nothing is announced at this time. That brings me close to the end of the presentation. The clock is ticking, however. If you are a Cloudyn user, you should start using and learning about Azure Cost Management as soon as possible, even if you continue to use Cloudyn at the same time. I suggest you start by listing what features in Cloudyn you are using and are important to you. Based on that list and looking at this deck, determine at which Azure Cost Management milestone you'll make the jump, and then plan and execute your transition. You should try to transition as soon as possible, but at least before the end of 2019. Also, as I mentioned earlier, this session was a focus on a comparison between Cloudyn and Azure Cost Management. I suggest you look at my Azure Cost Management video for a more comprehensive overview and demo really focused on Azure Cost Management itself. Here is a list of resources that may be helpful. I hope you found this session informative, and I hope this information will be helpful in your transition from Cloudyn to Azure Cost Management and in your cloud cost management generally. Thanks for listening, and goodbye for now.